Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's session of Workplace Investigations. This is part 5, and today we're talking about handling sensitive situations without adding stress. My name's Christina Wendell. I'm a partner in the Edmonton Employment and Labor Group for Dentons, and I am very pleased to be your moderator today, partly because it involves significantly less preparation time than presenting, but mostly because it gives me an opportunity to take in 3 excellent presentations from my colleagues. I'm thrilled to be joined today by my National Employment and Investigations team, who will be covering 3 core themes that reflect some of the toughest investigation challenges organizations are facing these days. We're going to start with Stephanie Lewis, counsel in our Ottawa office. Stephanie is an experienced bilingual employment law litigator and workplace investigator, as well as an engaging and always entertaining presenter. Stephanie is going to be helping us understand trauma in investigations and provide some tips for conducting trauma-informed investigations. Then we're going to have Victoria Merritt, Senior Associate from our Vancouver office. I believe Victoria just recently returned from a very well-deserved vacation, so we're happy to have her here with us today. She advises employers on proactive risk management and employment law and handles and advises on investigations. Victoria is going to be discussing remote interviews, some pros and cons and tips for conducting those. And then we have Julia Dales. She is a senior associate also in our Ottawa office. Julia's practice focuses on employment law and commercial litigation, including investigations and workplace management issues. Julia is going to be tackling the always interesting and increasingly relevant topic of workplace mobbing today and taking us through a few cases that have dealt with this issue. After our presentations, we will hopefully have time to open it up for your questions in the Q&A.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. The subtitle of this presentation is Squeezing a Really Big Topic into 15 Minutes. Next slide, please. So here's the agenda. Essentially, we're going to talk about what trauma-informed investigations are, how they appear in the context of our practices, and the advantages of a trauma-informed approach. And then I'm going to give you 5 tips for conducting your own trauma-informed investigations. This is a big topic. If anybody wants to unpack any of these issues in a later webinar, please let us know because we can do that. Next slide, please. So the good news for experienced workplace investigators is that a trauma-informed investigation is first and foremost an investigation. So it's the same sandbox and the same roles and rules apply. We are still neutral third parties who are tasked with finding out what more likely than not happened, and we're using the rules of procedural fairness to do this. And once we've figured out what more likely than not happened based on the evidence before us, we are making findings of whether there were any breaches of workplace policies or laws. So same sandbox. A trauma-informed approach, however, is an enhanced set of the skills that we are already using as workplace investigators. And that set of skills balances the experiences of the parties involved in the workplace investigation with our need to obtain relevant information on traumatic subjects. And in that balancing, the goal is to create a process in which everybody involved in the investigation feels respected, heard, and safe. So things that we consider when we're looking at these types of investigations or investigations that may have these implications are, first and foremost, whether or not the allegations involve potentially traumatic situations or experiences. If so, how, when, and where to ask questions so that people feel as safe as possible. And then finally, whether there are any other steps that can be taken to mitigate or reduce the possibility of re-traumatizing the people involved. Basically, the goal at the end of the day is to have people feel respected, heard, and safe. Next slide, please. So what is trauma? If we're looking for situations that might be traumatic, it's important to know what it is that we're looking for. And it's a very broad definition. Essentially, it's the long-lasting emotional response to a distressing event or experience. And it is as broad as it sounds. The impact of trauma can be negative on both the mind and the body of the people who've been in the traumatic situations. The way that we see this when we are dealing as workplace investigators with investigations is in situations where there have been allegations of sexual harassment or assault, workplace violence or bullying, discrimination on any protected ground, but some of them are particularly hot buttons, like including racism, sexual discrimination, gender discrimination, and any other event. This last pocket is important. Any other event that individuals find distressing and that results in a long-lasting emotional response. Now, here, sometimes I, as a workplace investigator, have received complaints where there are indicia in the complaints that the person is experiencing a trauma response to something that on its face may not appear to have been traumatic to your average bear. And in those circumstances, notwithstanding the allegation at issue, if you know that, or if you have indicators that somebody is experiencing trauma, you're still probably going to want to use the trauma informed lens because it's about their experience in the investigation and getting the best information that we can get. Next slide, please. If we come across trauma and hallmarks of trauma, we know right away that can have impacts both on the individuals involved and on the investigation that we're conducting. For individuals, you see some impacts here on the screen. It can impact their sense of safety, it can undermine their sense of self, and it can harm their ability to regulate emotions, which will manifest in the interviews often, and harm their ability to navigate relationships. So, in the context of workplace investigations that involve traumatic situations or allegations, it can impact how a witness recalls a traumatic event, including how they recall and perceive details. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. It can also cause a range of strong emotions that can impact the information that we're seeking. So someone could be talking about something traumatic could make a witness feel the anger that they feel about having experienced in the first place, the shame that they feel about what they've gone through, or feel afraid, feel the same fear that they may have felt back when the actual incident was occurring. And when faced with these emotions, if we don't respond appropriately and in a safe and trauma-informed manner, it can derail an interview. And we're going to talk about tips for safety and questioning later. I want to come back now to the impact on how witnesses recall events. So we've heard fight or flight mode being the survival, like the catchphrase for survival responses, right? But there are other survival responses, such as freezing. So it is exactly what it sounds like. If somebody experiences something traumatic, they can freeze, in which case everything stops. It can result in the mind going blank. It can result in a search for good options in a situation where someone is unprepared for what is happening to them. And it can result in a finding that there are no good options and the associated paralysis. It can also result in people dissociating, which is when people blank out and go on autopilot. And people who've dissociated can often describe themselves as having felt being outside of and disconnected from their bodies. So as you can imagine, in these circumstances, it can impact someone's ability to absorb what is happening to them and to recount it later. Next slide, please. Advantages of using trauma-informed approach. I'm sure that everyone who is here today knows that that it's a good idea. But the first and foremost, in my view, is that it reduces harm. If you're thinking about the lens in making this a safe space, in building trust, and getting people engaged in the process, and in asking the appropriate questions, you're going to reduce the risk of re-traumatizing parties who've already experienced what they felt as a trauma. You're reducing the potential for underreporting of incidents, because if it gets out that the approach that's taken is a respectful and safe one, then people who are experiencing things in the workplace or outside of the workplace in a way that is impacting their work life are going to be more likely to report. If you're asking the questions in a way that facilitates the most accurate and meaningful, detailed information in the circumstances, you can get a greater disclosure of the information that you need, which leads to more accurate outcomes, which leads to improved legal compliance. Everybody wins. And finally, it can enhance trust in employers. Now, I was recently at a conference on the weekend, and there was a panel, and the question was asked of a pile of legal experts on why DEI is important, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And someone who's very senior within their organization said it's good for business. So when I say it enhances, it's good for business, I know that the best reason to do something is not necessarily that it's good for business. It's an associated positive, but the fact that it's the right thing to do and that it respects and treats everyone well involved are definitely the priorities here. Next slide, please. So here are the five tips that we're going to go through in the next few minutes. Safety first. We're going to engage the people involved. We're going to build their trust. We're going to use empathy and empowerment during interviews. And in doing so, in conducting our interviews, we're going to ask the right questions. Next slide, please. So there are two types of safety when we talk about safety. The first is physical safety. And I know that Victoria, our excellent colleague and valued member of the Workplace Investigations National Team, is going to be speaking next about remote interviews. When we're talking about whether somebody is going to be participating in their interview, you want a setting that is safe, quiet, private, and free from other distractions to make sure that somebody is in a space where they feel comfortable sharing what they have to share and they are not concerned about being overheard, about potential other threats, about potential impacts. Psychological safety comes from clarity. So when we explain to people the moving parts of an investigation and how it impacts them and how we're conducting, it allows them to feel safe. It minimizes their uncertainty and helps them focus on telling their story without fear of judgment and exposure. So the way we do that is we tell them at the outset, and quite frankly, I do this in all my interviews, let alone the ones, not just the ones that involve particularly traumatic experiences. I start with an explanation of the process, my role in the process, who else will be involved, if anyone, how the information will be used, the limits on confidentiality. I explain that it isn't intended to be a pop quiz. So if I ask a question that they find confusing, to let me know so that I can clarify it. That because I'm a neutral third party, I have no vested interest in the outcome. And the purpose is to get their information to their best of their recollection. So as long as they tell me something honestly and to the best of their ability, there is no wrong answer. And then I give them an opportunity to ask any questions about the process before we start. And that tends to set us off on a good foot where people feel like they're empowered to tell their story. Next slide, please. Now, there are small things that we can do to engage participants, interviewees. We can ask them about questions about where they feel comfortable about how their interviews are conducted. So if they need to be working not only off-site, we have remote work, and we're going to hear more about safe remote interviews shortly. So if people need to participate remotely, that can be something that can usually be accommodated. Um, Things of that nature. We also offer appropriate support people, particularly where someone is having a very difficult time in navigating the process. The same limits to support people that apply in other investigations apply here. It can't be someone who would be a witness to the interview, and those people are there as support people and not to answer on behalf of the witness. So we set those expectations clearly, but we facilitate that. I see questions coming in. I'm aiming to get through the tips first. I will come back to the questions later. So these small choices help people become more engaged and involved. Next question, next slide, please. So building trust is more than about just one thing. It's about a persistent pattern of conduct. We start our interviews, just as I had mentioned, by building rapport. So you're not going to jump right into the most traumatic event right away. You're going to set the scene. You're going to ask some questions to make people comfortable. You're going to keep people informed about timelines and next steps. You're going to be consistent in your tone and actions. So if you tell somebody you're not judging them, but your body language is crossed and leaning back, that can undermine the trust that you're trying to build. You want to be respectful and non-judgmental, and then you want to be clear about what, as investigators, we know and what we don't. And we want to not make promises we can't keep. When we set commitments in terms of time frames, we want to follow through on those commitments and provide people with meaningful updates. Quite frankly, this is good advice for building trust in any working relationship, let alone a trauma-informed workplace investigation. Next slide, please. Using empathy and empowerment during interviews. There's a difference between empathy and sympathy. Empathy is putting yourself in someone else's shoes. And it shows that you have an ability to understand what they say they are feeling. Sympathy involves feeling for someone rather than with them. So examples of this can be expressing concern for someone or having pity for someone. Sympathy uh, can negatively impact our neutrality. It can impair our neutrality. So what we want to do is we want to tell people that we can empathize with the words that they're saying, and we hear what they're saying without applying any judgment. Ways that we can do this are by engaging in active listening. So, to the extent possible, we use the words that they use. We want to acknowledge the information that is being provided and their feelings. I've got some examples here. I can see that sharing this is hard for you. That's what you say instead of saying, "I'm so sorry this happened for you," because again, that could impair your neutrality, right? You say, "I appreciate you taking the time to share this with me. I appreciate from what you're saying that it is very difficult." Then there's some other examples here of empathy, taking breaks if you see that it may be required, seeking someone's permission before showing them graphic evidence, and being flexible in the order of questioning. So because not everybody will remember something traumatic chronologically. If you start open-ended and you say, please tell me what you remember about, and you see that when you get to a certain part, they're having difficulty and you had a follow-up, but you know you can save that for later, you can pivot. That's a bit of a spoiler on the questions that we're going to be asking in the next slide. So let's go there. So asking the right questions is a whole session in and of itself. Uh, the the big tips here, why can be a difficult question because it puts someone in the position of having to justify what they did or didn't do. And for people who are experiencing trauma, they may already be on their back foot. En français, if they're already on their back foot, ça peut les bouleverser. Like that can actually have someone fall back when they're already teetering on their ability to handle the question. So ways to ask instead of saying, why did you do this? Can you tell me about your considerations the considerations that factored into your decision to do this? That's one way to take the why out of it and still get the information. Please tell me more. What did you do next? What factored into this decision to do this next? So rephrasing why questions is one of many parts. You want to provide context for sensitive questions. This is particularly relevant when someone has a euphemism, like then they jumped me, or then they, he was on me. And you say, look, when I hear those words, I know what I think they mean, but those can mean different things for different people. And on that basis, I'm going to need you to explain in clear language what it is that happened. And then if there's something that is particularly hard, you're going to explain why you're asking that question so that people know that you're not just gratuitously asking this difficult question, you're asking it for a particular reason. One last tip on questions, and again, this could lend itself to an entire presentation. When some people, if someone is dissociated and let's think of an example we see in pop culture all the time, particularly in Law and Order SVU, one of my favorite television shows. If somebody is being sexually assaulted, in order to get through it and they dissociate, they might look at the wall just to get through it. So when we think of what has happened and what's most traumatic, we'd be thinking you've noticed the person on top of you. I won't get into that in great detail here, but what the person is focusing on visually may not be that. So in those circumstances, you may ask questions for cues from the other senses, from hearing, from smell, from any number of those things. And if you're going to do that, you're going to explain why. Say sometimes it is helpful in these circumstances to get information from that you may have noticed in other concepts. If I take you back to the incident involving so and so, and I ask you about your sense of smell, was there anything that comes to mind? When I ask you what you were hearing, is there anything that comes to mind? The other piece about this is stress can impact somebody's recall. And when that happens, sometimes you may want to consider having a second interview to give them the space they need to de-stress and to start again. There's so much more to be said on these topics. There is a summary on the next slide with takeaways that you can review at your leisure when the materials are forwarded next week. I look forward to discussing this further at a later point in this presentation. And in the meantime, I'm happy and delighted to pass you over to Victoria Merritt, a senior associate in our Vancouver office and an experienced member of our Workplace Investigations Practice Group, to tell you more about remote interviews. Over to you, Victoria.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. And I'm impressed you got through that topic within as much detail as you did in the time that you had. So, I am speaking about remote interviews made easy. This is a topic that I think can feel fraught, but it's really not because your best practices for remote interviews, including all of the tips Stephanie just spoke about when you're using a trauma-informed lens, those don't actually change from a substantive perspective. So, Really, I'm going to be talking about kind of how do you decide where a remote interview is appropriate, and then a few tips for remote interviews specifically that make them a little bit different to manage than in person. And of course, remote interview is any interview that's not in person. I'm going to be generally speaking about video interviews, Zoom, Teams, what we're doing today, as opposed to phone interviews, although there's limited circumstances where those can be used as well. Next slide, please. So, of course, virtual interviews, like virtual everything else, really became common practice during the pandemic when workplace issues didn't disappear, but the ability to have in-person things happen did functionally for a long period of time. So, in terms of some of the pros and cons of in-person versus virtual, in-person is traditionally considered the gold standard for credibility assessments, and it took a global pandemic, I think, to really move the legal profession away from this assumption that you had to have things in person to assess credibility. You'll see there's an asterisk next to this because, when our last one of these seminars, we talked about how to assess credibility. One of the ways to assess credibility can include personal demeanor, but that is not the best, and it can cause issues. So, for example, going back to trauma informed, maybe they're not looking at you or making eye contact because they're actually having a trauma response. It doesn't mean that they're being dishonest. So all of those kind of normal or historical factors are no longer as relevant. So this pro is not actually as significant as it was once thought. Rapport building is easier in person still, generally. This is not an insurmountable obstacle with remote, but typically being in a room with people, it's easier to build that trust and rapport that's so important for workplace investigations. And you have more management and control over the environment as the investigator. So, who's there, where it happens, is it private, how is it set up? I missed snacks off the pros list, which was a big omission, but of course, you can have things like water, Kleenex, snacks. You control all of that in a in-person space. Cons, it's of course more expensive. It can involve travel time or booking meeting space. It can be less flexible and less convenient for you as the investigator or for the witness. It can actually be more disruptive if done in the workplace, depending on your workplace environment. Open office concepts are kind of a nightmare for conducting discrete workplace investigations. If I'm doing in person, I'll typically offer the person to come to me, except for in some circumstances, which we'll talk about. And it can be less trauma informed if it's not the preference of the complainant. And this is kind of switching now into the pros for virtual. You'll see I've said more comfortable for the witness. The asterisk is there is that, of course, that's not always true. It depends on your witness. I recently had someone who really wanted in person. They were a little older. They preferred in person. They were uncomfortable with technology, and it was really important to them to shake my hand and meet me, and that's fine. On the other hand, I've also had witnesses where they were so relieved and so happy that they were able to do it virtually from their home. They had a cat on their lap. It was just an environment where they felt comfortable, safe, secure. And of course, virtual can be more convenient. It can be more flexible in terms of scheduling. And it's also tends to be cheaper and can be quite efficient. Cons, you have less control over the environment, where they are, who's there, what the distractions are. There's tips to manage that, which we'll talk about. You, of course, have the risk of technical difficulties. No matter how tech savvy you think you are, sometimes things just go wrong or don't work, and you don't know how tech savvy your witness is going to be. Many people now, thankfully, for things like Teams and Zoom, it's very easy for people to use and they're used to it, but it's not always the case. It can be harder to establish rapport, and it can also be harder to manage things like physical evidence and documents. Next slide, please. So, what format is best? It depends. Skipping to the bottom of the slide, best practice is to give the option where possible, but try to be consistent between parties. So don't force one person to come in person if you're giving the other person the option of virtual, just kind of from a fairness standpoint for your parties specifically. Ideally, you give them the option with what they're most comfortable with. And I've been surprised how many people have selected virtual when I do give the option where it's possible. In terms of deciding whether you can give that option, what's the nature of the complaint? So, are you dealing with really traumatic content. This can cut either way, right? Then it's maybe really important to give the complainant the option of where they are. Is the individual even allowed to be in the workplace right now, right? Sometimes respondents are on a paid leave or are working from home as an interim measure. Maybe that makes virtual or a different space much more appropriate than trying to do in person. How complex or lengthy is the investigation? Thinking of, for example, you have a remote work environment, maybe then it is important to actually either do in person or it's not possible. And you need to understand the workplace is the other question. This is more relevant if you're doing an external investigation, but is it important to actually understand the lay of the physical land to understand what happened based on the allegations that have been made? That may also play in. What's the scope of evidence required from the witness? I mentioned at the beginning, if you have a witness, they have two or three things to confirm. It's not controversial. Their credibility is not going to be an issue. Maybe a phone interview is appropriate. In person is probably overkill for that person. If you're spending 3 days with a complainant or a full day with a complainant, maybe an in-person meeting space is going to be best. Budget and timing considerations. What are your limitations there? The types of evidence involved, this again can cut both ways. So, for example, something like CCTV footage might actually be easier to show in a virtual space than in physical and less tech setup. It just depends. And then what's your actual availability of interview space? Again, so what is your office environment? What's your tech setup? What applications do you have access to? And again, at the end of the day, it really is going to be kind of your assessment. Does it matter? Is there a format I prefer or need to have? If not, let's give the parties the option so that they can choose the environment that's going to be most comfortable for them. Again, with that goal of getting the best evidence possible out of the parties. Next slide, please. So now we're going to assume that you are doing a remote or virtual interview, and we'll dive into some tips to manage this. And again, substantively, your interview and your investigation practices are not going to change, just like applying a trauma-informed lens doesn't take you out of the investigation sandbox, to quote Stephanie's example. So obviously confirm your format, Zoom, MS Teams, do you have some sort of internal application that everyone's comfortable with and uses? It doesn't matter as long as you know how to use it, you're confident the witness will know how to use it, and it's secure. So I have a few things in terms of knowing and managing security options. This might not be on you. This might be something your organization hopefully has handled anyways, your data and privacy practices and policies. But make sure you're using something that, of course, it's a unique meeting ID. You have a password required to sign in. I'm always surprised sometimes people use like their personal Zoom workspace. Don't do that. Use a unique meeting ID, have it passworded. Require host approval so you don't have an awkward situation where they log in before you're ready. You have that virtual lobby space set up. Disable things like meeting invite forwarding so that you are controlling who's in the virtual room. And consider disabling recording features if possible. And I'll touch on recordings in the virtual setting in a minute, which I know is a fear many people have of using that format. Tech checks ahead of time, again, for yourself and your witness. You both need to know how to use the platform. Again, I'm not finding practically this comes up as an issue too often. And then, of course, be cognizant of any kind of documents or evidence you are going to want to share and have a strategy for how you're going to share that. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Next slide. So again, ahead of the interview, make sure you send a calendar invite and a link to the witness once you have a time scheduled. Scheduling time, make sure you leave a buffer. One of the dangers of a remote interview is it's easy to schedule things back to back, not just for you, but for the witness. There's nothing worse than being deep into an investigation and having your witness say, "Oh, I have to hop off for my 9:45 call, sorry." Make sure you leave a buffer and allow more time than you think you need so that you don't run against that. When you're sending the calendar invite, think about, again, privacy and confidentiality. Make the calendar event private so that the person's assistant or other coworkers, if there's a shared calendar, are not going to be able to see workplace investigation interview, sexual harassment allegation, for example, and use a neutral title. Include instructions in the invite about access and use of the application, and include contact information in case you have technical difficulties. This does not have to be your contact information. It could be IT. provided that you're obviously not disclosing anything about the nature of the meeting. It's just a normal request for IT support. This is going back to, again, some of Stephanie's comments, communicating expectations ahead of time. Extra important when you're in a virtual space because you're just managing, to some extent, logistics. So, confidentiality and privacy. I need you to be in a private space. Please do not be on the ferry or at the airport or in a coffee shop, which are all places I've seen people try to join meetings from. Make sure you've addressed ahead of time what those expectations are for where the person's coming from. A home office, generally going to be fine. Evidence, make sure it's clear how and when they're supposed to be sending you documents. Logistics, any tech requirements that they might need to have. Make sure it's clear, it's going to be video. You can address what to wear, which I find is sometimes a concern people have for interviews, especially with external investigators, and address if there's going to be a support person involved, or any other logistical things. For example, translators. Again, translators, in some ways, it's almost easier virtual. They can sign in from anywhere. So that's not going to be an impediment to using a virtual environment just because you have other support persons involved. You just need to know and address and think about that ahead of time. Next slide, please. So during the interview, again, best practices remain as for an in-person interview in terms of the types of question you're asking. Introduction, don't just jump in. Virtual environments can still be awkward. Have some sort of icebreaker or rapport builder if you don't, already have some of that, depending on your role. If you're doing an internal investigation, and let the witness get a bit comfortable. I default to saying, sorry, you might hear my dog bark because I'm in my home office, um, or something else, that kind of establishes a bit of a bond. If I've, have an anecdote or the weather's terrible, which sometimes, happens in Vancouver, you might mention that or ask a bit about them and just get that little small talk. Allow that to happen in the virtual space. Make sure your opening comments, you're going to have opening comments in person as well, but make sure that they're addressing your commitment to privacy and confidentiality. So again, I like to open with, I'm at my home office. It's a private setting. No one can hear you. My dog might be outside my door, but that's it. Your expectations of them, I want to confirm that you're in a room by yourself, or, oh, I see that your support person is there. Hello, nice to meet you. Your expectations limit is regarding active participation. So this is managing distractions, in a virtual environment. You don't want them Black Friday shopping as a way to try and avoid the investigation or checking emails or scrolling through notes, distracted. Manage that ahead of time in your opening. Manage recordings. If you're going to record, let them know that. If that is a practice you use, tell them not to record it and ask them not to. Of course, you can't verify or control that they're not doing that, but make sure that you let them know that the expectation is they're not. And of course, don't forget to take breaks. It's easy to not take breaks, I think, or not pick up on some of those physical cues that somebody needs to use the bathroom or needs a snack or a glass of water. Pay attention and make sure that you have a note or a reminder to take breaks at appropriate intervals. Document management, if you go to the next slide, I'll talk about that a bit more in a bullet point on the next slide. So screen share savvy, make sure you have closed out other windows, you have your inbox open, you have documents unrelated to this or related to this that the witness shouldn't see open. Be very careful, know how to use your screen share in a way that's protecting information. Be comfortable with the sound of silence. Again, I find this is sometimes harder in a virtual environment than elsewhere, but I think it's important to allow or try to allow that natural flow of conversation to occur virtually as it might in person. Make sure you're not distracted, make sure they're not, and have a plan in place to manage any technical difficulties. Again, if that's calling IT, they should have your contact information. Otherwise, that's really the tips I have for you. And again, I think it's not a practice that's going away. So I'm happy to turn things over to Julia for the very spicy topic of workplace mobbing. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you, Victoria. So workplace mobbing is a form of harassment that's been discussed by scholars and more recently by adjudicators. It can be a little more nuanced and insidious than harassment that we normally think of, and it also has real consequences. So today I'm going to go over ways to identify workplace mobbing, relevant considerations when conducting a workplace investigation, and mitigation strategies to try and identify and prevent mobbing. So if we could go to the first slide, please. So I've defined workplace mobbing here as bullying behaviors by a group of workers designed to humiliate, pressure, undermine, or demean a coworker. This is a simple definition based on common themes and how it's been described by adjudicators and scholars. And overt forms of this can include, verbal abuse and violence, racist or sexist remarks, but subtle forms that the employer might not have visibility on are, isolation of an employee socially or from work opportunities, dirty looks, impeding an ability of an employee to advance in the workplace, either overworking them, underworking them, or withholding information is another example of how this can be done. So essentially, life is made very difficult for the target. And this form of harassment occurs through a number of different behaviors in different individuals. One adjudicator described mobbing as harassing behavior engaged in by a group directed at a target, and methods can include humiliation, trumped up accusations, pervasive and persistent but unpredictable versions of harassment, lies, and innuendo. And another adjudicator described it as a group of employees picking on, undermining, or demeaning a coworker. And so the conduct really is far spreading and diverse. And so that's why workplace mobbing is a little bit more difficult to assess and investigate. Next slide, please. So, like harassment of one person by another, or any sort of workplace bullying or discrimination, it can lead to consequences for the individual who is experiencing the behavior. So, obviously, loss of confidence, self-esteem, feeling unsafe at work, helpless, frustration. When speaking of a complainant in a mobbing situation, one adjudicator expressly noted that it made the complainant feel small, and even what she did try to achieve congeniality was never enough, and it undermined her feelings of dignity and self-esteem. And then obviously physical and psychosomatic symptoms that can flow from all that include panic and anxiety, and inability to sleep, loss of concentration, all the things you'd associate with depressive or anxious feelings. And next slide, please. But in addition to impacts on your individual employee, uh, workplace mobbing can have serious impacts on the workplace. So, toxicity and poisoned workplace can result, which is different than workplace mobbing in and of itself. A poisoned, toxic workplace is a workplace that can feel unsafe for others, intolerable, hostile, oppressive. So even if you're not experiencing this mobbing directly, being in that environment can result in feeling unsafe. Um, Obviously, if someone's being targeted at work, then they might not show up. It will lead to isolation at work. This all, of course, can cause increased turnover, and an increased risk for more serious incidents like violence if we're in this sort of pressure cooker of harassment. And then all of those things can lead to decreased productivity, lower quality of work, and all of that comes down as well to costs to the company. People are more likely to go on stress or medical leaves if they're experiencing this behavior or it's occurring in the workplace. If employees leave work and their employment because of harassment or workplace mobbing, they might claim constructive dismissal against the employer. They might bring human rights claims, occupational health and safety claims. And so all of this does come at a cost to the workplace. Um, Next slide, please. So workplace mobbing can occur more in high pressure, high work environments where there's competition or jealousies, tight deadlines. Also, if there's lack of clear harassment prevention policies and procedures. Um, One court noted that the targeted person in workplace mobbing can often be a high achiever in the company. So if there's hostilities growing because someone keeps being recognized, for example, as sort of um, the rising star and others are shamed, then hostilities can grow from that. And if managers and supervisors aren't trained to spot certain behaviors or there's a lack of clear reporting, then that will allow workplace mobbing to occur and continue. And then, of course, there can be workplace mobbing that's caused by dislike of a worker, but also that dislike can be based on protected grounds or other prejudice against that person. And there's often or sometimes a trigger event that has led to this person being targeted, which I'll talk more about. Next slide, please. So challenges with investigating workplace mobbing are that multiple parties are involved in the behaviors, and the behaviors, like I said, can range from extremely subtle to more serious. And if someone makes a complaint of mobbing, it can look kind of like a weak complaint if you're parsing it apart. So if one person's made a certain joke and someone else has looked at them wrong, or they're being excluded by different individuals, then it can be difficult to identify. Also, if there's a pattern of behavior that's been occurring over a long period and building up over time, then some of the incidents you're going to be considering happened a long time ago, and the evidence might not be as clear about what actually occurred. Or there can be the opposite. There can be a lack of a single clear incident, and someone is just talking about this atmosphere or the way that they're feeling around certain people. Um, of course, if there is workplace mobbing and there's groups or cliquiness, then individuals can fear reprisal, whether socially or by employees who are supervising and managing them and involved. So they might be reluctant to participate or to be forthright in the investigation. Um, and then another difficulty is differentiating mobbing from interpersonal conflict, because there is a level of personality conflict that's normal and can occur in a workplace without rising to harassment. Adjudicators are clear that employees don't all need to like each other or get along. Disagreements can be had. And so we do see complaints sometimes where someone is alleging harassment, but it's that they have a personality conflict and argument with someone, or it's performance management, which we know is also not a form of harassment when exercised reasonably. So recognizing mobbing can be challenging for those reasons. Next slide, please. So when you are investigating allegations with respect to a number of individuals and a number of actors targeting someone, it's important not to look at each individual incident necessarily, but also look at the incidents as a whole and recognize a pattern. And one adjudicator noted uh, that the importance is there's an importance in not parsing a victim's complaint down to a few incidents of dubious accuracy. Rather, read in its entirety, the complaint in that case was of mobbing, where a group of employees pick upon, undermine, and demean a coworker in this pattern of behavior. Um, Another thing is to consider the timing of the complaint that's coming forward. So if you're looking at the evidence and there was something that may have triggered the behavior, a promotion, a hiring, a complaint, a structural change in the organization that maybe has caused people to react in that way, then that can be helpful, a helpful consideration to assess whether mobbing is occurring. Also trying to get evidence, trying to recognize group dynamics. Are there ringleaders? Are there followers? What are the social groups like in terms of the evidence that's being given? and identifying witnesses who can provide objective evidence, and also having an eye to the culture of the organization and possible organization contributors, like how performance is recognized and rewarded and things like that. Um, there's a case where a female coworker, for example, was asked or was on a leave and then came back to work and joined an all-male team. And she complained to one of member of the team about another guy on the team's behavior because he was texting and driving and swearing. So she thought she was doing that safely, but the group of men she worked with started ganging up on her, and they all were all sitting in a vehicle, for example, and they started saying snitches get stitches. And on one occasion, one of the grievers had a rock and summoned her over, and they were talking about, cutting with it. And they kept on other occasions, one of them had a knife and would say snitches get stitches again. And so there's all of this conduct um, over time in different incidents. And that's the case where the adjudicator said, we can't parse each of these incidents. We have to look at this as a pattern. And she said, because the grievers who were terminated as a result of their conduct had said, well, we were joking on this case, or she laughed in this in this incident. And the adjudicator said that the question is, were they joking or were they disrespectful of her in ways intended to make her feel excluded, intended to dehumanize her, and directed at making her work life unpleasant until she conformed to norms or their perceived hierarchy of authority. The adjudicator also noted that the fact that those individuals acted in concert and in a mobbing way added substantially to the gravity of what they had done. And next slide, please. Oh, and I'll just note as well that in terms of following up on what Stephanie said about trauma-informed investigations, in that case, the complainant did recognize that she would laugh at these jokes sometimes, and the adjudicator said that that's because she felt she had to put up with it based on the evidence. And so it's really important to keep in mind that reactions of complainants and victims can be diverse and not always consistent with what you would expect. And we will go to, oh, sorry, we are on the slide. Excellent. Okay. So in terms of identifying mobbing, looking for in your workplace if there's repeated concerns about one department or a team or high turnover in that area or persistent complaints of an interpersonal issue or multiple employees reporting tension or cliques, then those are signs that your workplace may be conducive to a workplace mobbing. And you can use things like anonymous reporting or pulse surveys to check in on how people are feeling in the workplace to start trying and identifying those risks. Having, in terms of prevention, strong policies and procedures, including clear reporting and escalation measures, is really important. Providing training to managers and supervisors to recognize these types of more subtle behaviors that can occur, subtle bullying behaviors, regular check-ins, and then building a safe culture with respect to how feedback's provided, how are employees rewarded or disciplined, and our top performers singled out while shame-based mechanisms are used to address underperformers, things like that, and then monitoring workload and ensuring that work seems to be fairly distributed. And another thing I want to note with investigations, last point, is even during an investigation into workplace mobbing, if precautions are being taken to protect the complainant, one adjudicator noted that even in doing that, in the response to a complaint, make sure to consider workplace dynamics, because if, for example, the complainant is being protected by being moved off the team or the floor, it's important to consider how are others in the workplace going to see that? Are they going to see that, oh, I guess she is the problem, and perceive that that she's the issue, and that contributes to further bullying. So considering the workplace dynamic through the whole process is important. Um, and having a view to workplace dynamics as a whole can help mitigate the risk of toxicity and of mobbing. And so I will leave it at that.
Perfect. Thank you. Just waiting for there we go, my camera to react. Thank you to the three of you. I will just say I am absolutely astounded that you got through everything and all in the expected time. That was a lot of information, I know. So for those of you who need to leave, we're going to have a few questions at the end, but for those of you who need to leave, just know that we will be sharing the presentation and the slides, the recording will be shared about a week or so after today. So just turning to some questions, and maybe what I'll do is I'll start with Victoria, because there were a few questions with the remote interviews talking about recording the remote interviews. And also the use of AI kind of impact on confidentiality, but any sort of considerations that you can think of to recording those remote interviews? And is that any different from, sitting there? I remember a few investigations in early days in person where we had the little dictaphone that we just put on the table to record the in-person interviews. Kind of any sort of different considerations that come into play when you're looking at remote interviews.
I don't think so. Other than that, it's easier, of course, to record virtually into the other person recording without your knowledge. I frankly assume many people are recording many things, even if they ought not to, when you're in a virtual setting and you can't control that. But in terms of the considerations of do you record, do you not, those are all the same factors. And definitely keep in mind, if you make a recording, it's going to be something that somebody is going to want at some point in the proceedings. If things go sideways or litigation results, that recording is now going to be something that needs to be preserved and might be requested and might be producible, right? Subject to all of the usual considerations around kind of can we make it privileged? Is there confidentiality? So I think just being aware that that's a risk when you do make a recording for the purpose of helping out with notes. AI use in investigations in virtual spaces, I feel you could do a whole topic on. Maybe that's our next seminar. I am a little skeptical and very careful thinking about using tools like transcription, like automatic transcription and things, because they're not completely accurate. And again, when it's so important that things be accurate, you're making decisions. I think there's a big risk in relying too heavily on those tools. Is there a role for them with a lot of care? Perhaps, but they also open up a whole bunch of privacy considerations and, what third-party vendors providing the AI service, how secure is it, who has access to that, how long is that retained? Do you need to disclose that you're now using AI depending on the jurisdiction you're in? So it opens up a bit of a black hole of potential complications using those tools. So the answer is not a straight yes or no, it's bad to use them. It's a topic that involves a lot of care, especially around privacy and accuracy and vetting those tools. Stephanie, anything to add on the recordings piece or AI?
I do. Just from my own personal experience, recording like anything else is good. You're going to make your decision on a case by case basis as a lawyer and in a situation where as the investigator, there's already a power imbalance, right? Because at the end of the day, the investigator is the one who's going to be making the findings on a balance of probabilities. There's already a power imbalance. So as counsel, I tend not to record. I tend to have a second investigator on sensitive investigations where they attend with me. We are both taking notes. We cross compare our notes and we prepare a summary, which we provide to the person after the fact. So that's how we handle it. We certainly know that recording is permissible. If you're going to do it, you let people know. In terms of AI, our firm has an AI policy and any place using AI should. And part of our AI policy is anything produced by AI should be meaningfully reviewed by the lawyer who is working with that AI. So to the point that Victoria helpfully made, with that you don't want to rely on something too heavily because it may produce errors, or as they're called in the biz, hallucinations. I mean, has anyone seen those weird fingers from AI? Like we're going to review, if you do use it, you're going to want to review it in a meaningful way to confirm that jives with your recollection and correct anything that's not. But those are just a few additions to your very well-informed and excellent answer, Victoria.
Thank you both. I agree, and I share your skepticism. The fact that after many years, Siri still doesn't know that I don't have an H in my name is somewhat disturbing. So maybe I'll turn now to Stephanie while you're here. I'll keep you on. This was one that I think you may have answered in writing too, but I thought it would be useful to share. And that's what about if during an interview you have the respondent raise some potential trauma? Is there anything different you would do? How would you handle that?
So, and thank you to the person who submitted that question. It's a very good question. And the interesting thing about trauma-informed investigations is that the intention of those investigations is for everyone to feel safe and respected, not just the complainant, even though traditionally it can be the complainant who's experiencing the fear, the anger, the really strong emotions that come with a traumatic reaction. Sometimes those traumatic reactions we encounter when we're dealing with the respondent. So if someone who is a respondent reveals a trauma that is impacting their ability to participate, we're going to use the same skills that we would use with a complainant. We are going to use the active listening. We're going to acknowledge their sense of what they've felt. We're going to mirror their language. We're going to try and be empathetic. At the end of the day, a prior traumatic experience is not permission to traumatize others. And we all know that. But when we're assessing the evidence that we have at the end of the day, we're going to factor we're going to make the findings we're going to make based on the evidence. We can still have an empathetic and trauma informed interview, notwithstanding the fact that there still may be findings of bullying, harassment, sexual assault against the person who experienced trauma. Often, if that factors into providing context, that will be addressed in the report itself. But at the end of the day, we still have the same goal, which is to get the most informed and best information. In order to do that, all parties, whether they are respondent, complainant, or witnesses, need to feel safe sharing what they experienced. Does that work?
Excellent. Thank you, Stephanie. And I think this will be the last question. This one will be for Julia. So Julia, the question came in, if there's a situation where there's a group of employees who come in to share concerns or complaints about a manager, is that something that would be considered group mobbing? And just kind of distinguish between a group of employees expressing their concerns in a group with the workplace mobbing, and maybe considering employees maybe doing that because it makes them feel safe and it gives them some comfort to come in and share those concerns
Sure.
together.
So if a group of employees comes forward with a complaint about one individual, and the complaint is in good faith, so they are experiencing behavior from their manager that is harassing or that they have concerns about, then no, that wouldn't be a form of bullying or harassment. However, false accusations are a form of workplace mobbing when they're made by a group of people. And so what we look for what we look for if a group of people are making a complaint, and I've been on an investigation where this exactly happened, where a group of individuals came forward complaining about their manager, but it became evident that they had actually more or less orchestrated this complaint because there was a power struggle between one of them and the manager, and they didn't like their manager. And so what we looked for and what became obvious in that complaint was there was coordinated narratives. They were using very similar catch phrases. The documentary evidence didn't support what they were saying about the manager. And we also spoke to some witnesses who were more objective. They had closely worked with the team, but didn't have a stake in the game. So they were able to give evidence. And so in that case, there was this orchestrated false accusation, which is workplace mobbing, but reasonable good faith complaints about a manager or other person are not necessarily are not bullying or harassing behaviors.
That's excellent. Yeah, thanks, Julie. And those similar catchphrases, that's one that I've seen before, and it's interesting and often easy to spot as you get going through it. Well, I think that brings us to time. Just want to thank everyone. Thanks to the panelists for their time, their expert guidance. Thanks to everyone who joined us here today for the discussion. We hope the session has given you some practical tools and insights on how to navigate these often very difficult issues in a way that's fair, effective, and respectful of everyone. If you do have any further questions or are looking for some tailored advice on any of these topics, please do not hesitate to reach out to any one of us. Otherwise, thank you for your time, and we look forward to connecting with you all again. Thank you.